Weingart. Winds it up, delivers. Thome drills one high and deep to center. Away, way back. Gone deep into the picnic plaza, and that might have even got out of the ballpark. Jim Thome has just left Jacobs Field onto Eagle Avenue. That will take 2 tape measures.
Well, that was quick. It feels like just yesterday we were kicking off this podcast here at the Buckeye Scoop with our top 10 storylines to watch during the 2020 baseball season. That was episode 1 in the history of this podcast, just a bit outside our Cleveland Indians podcast here at the Scoop. And really does feel like just yesterday that we were talking about the upcoming season, what to watch for, a lot of kind of what was going on with things that seemed like we were talking about them a long time ago, but it really wasn't. Things like the Cleveland Indians team name and the future of Francisco Lindor in Cleveland, and really expected a lot of those storylines to kind of drag out through the season. But that really wasn't the case. We closed our eyes for a minute, and when we opened them again, it was playoff time. And that was officially the quickest Major League Baseball season of my lifetime, and not just because it was the fewest amount of games, although that was obviously true as well, but it really felt like the exact opposite of a traditional baseball season. When you get to the 100-game mark, during a normal season, and you can't believe there's still over 60 games left in the regular season, it just seems to really never end as you keep going night after night. This was like rapid fire. This is like we're running a podcast episode in the morning and everything's changed, by the next day because something happened that night because there's a game pretty much every single night. So this was rapid fire baseball, a little bit more exciting. I think you think about a traditional Major League Baseball season, kind of feels like it covers all 4 seasons. It covers, all the other sports. I feel like when baseball starts, we're still talking about kind of the middle of the NBA season, and by the time it's over, you're in the middle of the NFL season. And so it just seems to go on and on in a typical year, but this was the opposite of that. And, that's exactly what we kind of thought. That's exactly what I was talking about, at the beginning in our, first or second episode of this podcast, was just how quickly this season was going to go and how much fun it was going to be to have 60 games in like 65 days, it felt like. And so this season was gone in a flash, 60 games here and gone. I would say hard to believe that we're already talking playoffs, but it's really not hard to believe that we're already talking playoffs because it was here and gone. And 60 games, we were just talking about the trade deadline, which obviously that whole system, that whole timing was off this year because of the shortened schedule. And it feels like just yesterday we were talking about, who's going to be the Indians' everyday outfielders and where were they going to go, with this lineup. And now we're talking about, what are the pitching matchups going to be for the opening round of the American League playoffs. And so very, very quick season. Still crazy to think that there would normally be another 102 games left to play in this season. And, that makes sense, right? By the time we get to October, feels like about 5 years have gone by typically since spring training. But that's not the case. We're moving rapid fire here. So welcome back to episode 7 of our podcast, Just a Bit Outside. We're talking Cleveland Indians. We're talking Major League Baseball playoffs here at the Buckeye Scoop. I am your host, Brandon Castel, and we are going to dive into the Cleveland Indians, kind of the way they ended their season and what is in store for this team as they start to look ahead at the playoffs. They went 35-25 during the regular season, so 10 games over 500. I like the way that they closed out the season, especially that 4-game sweep of the Chicago White Sox. I think that was really kind of the defining moment of this season. They really needed a series like that against a team like the Chicago White Sox that a lot of people were starting to kind of pick as a potential dark horse for the World Series. and they came out and swept them in 4 games. And that kind of really started the ball rolling here to the point that they didn't come back and win the division, although they got darn close over that final weekend. They had a chance, potentially. They needed the Cincinnati Reds essentially to sweep the Minnesota Twins, and they needed the Cubs to take care of the White Sox, which they did. And the Reds actually held their own against the Twins, but they couldn't get the sweep. The Indians couldn't quite get the sweep. And so here we are, 10 games over 500, tied for second place in the division with the White Sox, but they have the tiebreaker over Chicago. And so the Indians are in the playoffs. They would have made it, theoretically, if the playoffs had not been expanded under this new format. But crazy to think that in a normal season at 35-25, we would just be getting started. And typically the Indians don't start off 35-25. They tend to struggle, at least historically, in the early part of the season. Now, again, some of that might be due to weather, which they were able to avoid because of the late start this year. But 35-25 would really just be kind of the start of the season. You're really, almost like your first 1/3 of the season. And so feels a little strange to be kind of jumping from that right into the playoffs, but I really think this has been some of the most enjoyable baseball we've had in a long time. Every game mattered. Every night seemed like it was worth tuning in because, one thing could kind of spark something. One game could kind of get this team rolling. And, every night was important. Every start was important. They were able to throw a high caliber quality starter out there almost every night. For most of the season, they obviously had a little bit of stretch there where Clevenger and Plesac were not with the team. But other than that, they were really able to put someone on the mound almost every night that gave you a chance to win. And so it was an exciting season to watch. I also liked the expanded rosters where you had a few more guys that they were able to plug in there. They didn't have to make some of the tough decisions that you normally make. Are you going to force a kid to play every day who's not ready, or keep a kid on the roster just so that, you don't have to cut him loose, but he's not playing well enough or anything like that. It felt like they were able to really see what some of these guys could bring to the team this year. It didn't include my boy Yu Chang. We talked about him back in episode 1 of this podcast. He was the spring training darling, showed a lot of power in spring training, thought that, he might get a chance to play this year, a guy who could probably play, really anywhere on the middle or left side of the infield, third, short, second, could have potentially given you, a look there. They tried him early in the season, but he ended up with just 2 hits in 11 at-bats. Oscar Mercado took a huge step backward this year. He was another guy we talked about in the kind of storylines. Was Oscar Mercado going to take that next step to becoming a star? He was hot the first half of last year, his rookie year, and then like so many others, he kind of faded down the stretch. So was very interested to see what Mercado could do because, man, he was fun to watch. When he was hitting the ball well, when he was hitting 300, playing center field, making great plays, he was really fun to watch. So was very interested to see what he might do this year. He ended up hitting just $128 with 6 RBIs and 86 at-bats. So you start to have to wonder now about his future in the big leagues. Is he going to be able to find it? Is he going to be a part of the future, which is unfortunate because he's a kid that seemed to have a lot of talent. But if you can't hit big league pitching, there's a lot of guys who have been good at fielding and running and been able to hit, a little bit of power. But if you can't hit consistently, it's going to be tough to find your place in the big leagues. Obviously, Greg Allen and Mike Clevenger ended up in San Diego. And at the end of the day, no Cleveland Indians hit over 300 for the season. So no one on the team hit 300, and yet here we are. The Indians did enough in this shortened season to snag the number 4 seed in the American League. For a while, it looked like they might end up as the number 7 team, which would have meant a road trip playing on the road in the first round against, I think, Oakland or Tampa, depending on kind of how things shook out. But instead, they will get to host their first-round playoff series here in Cleveland. Now, unfortunate that we can't pack Jacobs Field or Progressive Field, and, that would be a fun environment, especially with the Yankees coming to town. And, maybe we can call out the Midges, get them going, and really channel some of that old magic against the New York Yankees. But that is the matchup that the Indians got. Probably not the preferred matchup, a team like the Yankees, but I really like the Indians' chances against really anyone in the American League this year except for the Minnesota Twins. I did not want them to have to play their division rival Twins in the playoffs, at least in the first round. The Twins have had their number all season, and they hit well enough, they pitch well enough. Again, they're going to have to face the Twins or play the Twins at some point in the playoffs if they're going to make it, to the World Series. But I think a first-round matchup with the Twins would have been kind of the worst-case scenario. Yankees were pretty high on my list. Astros as well, just because they hit so well. Obviously, the Astros without those buzzers not hitting quite as well. But the Yankees have so many big bats that they can throw at you that, this was when you saw it pop up on the screen or you saw it pop up on paper, you thought to yourself, oh no, it's the Yankees. That probably is not the matchup that people wanted. However, when you dig into the numbers, you'll find out that the 2020 Yankees didn't end up being a reincarnation of the 1927 Yankees. And a lot of people thought maybe they would early on. They were crushing the ball early in the season. I know we talked about it on this podcast that I just didn't think the Indians had enough hitting to even be competitive with the Yankees the way they looked early in the season. So we'll get into that on today's show. We're going to talk about the emergence of Jose Ramirez and whether, he deserves to be in the MVP conversation for what he did the second half of the year. We'll look at kind of the long-term chances here of this series and, where could the Indians go. But before we get into anything else, we have to celebrate the incredible season, the incredible performance really all year long of Shane Bieber, Cy Bieber, MVPieber. Can that be a thing? MVPieber? Maybe we'll coin that hashtag MVPieber on this show because there is no question about it that Shane Bieber is in the MVP conversation. He's certainly in the Cy Young Award conversation. He is the Major League's first Triple Crown winner as a pitcher since 2006. So the first player to sweep the Triple Crown when you think about strikeouts, ERA, and wins across the board since 2006, and the first pitcher in Indians history to ever accomplish that feat as the Major League Baseball Triple Crown winner. So Bob Feller was the AL Triple Crown winner in 1940. That was the last guy to accomplish that. Nobody in the history of this franchise has accomplished what Shane Bieber did in 2020. And that's pretty darn remarkable when you think about some of the guys they've had over the years. You can go back certainly to guys like Bartolo Colon and Cliff Lee, but even more recently with Corey Kluber. You think about guys like Carlos Carrasco when they've been at their peak. You think about Trevor Bauer, who we'll get into today, and some of the other guys that the Indians have had in their starting rotation over the years. And then here comes Shane Bieber. He really replaced Corey Kluber as the ace, and they didn't miss a beat. In fact, they got better, based on his performance this season. And so let's get into that. Shane Bieber, for the year, finished this season, again, shortened season, 8-1 with a 1.63 ERA and a 0.87 WHIP. So walks plus hits per innings pitched, so an extremely low amount of base runners allowed this season. He struck out 122 batters in just over 77 innings pitched, and all of that in just 12 starts. So he won 8 out of his 12 starts. And if you multiply that out over a full season, let's call it maybe 33 starts over the course of the year, which is what Bieber had in 2019, you are looking at not only the best pitching, the best numbers of the best pitching season in Major League Baseball this year. You're really looking at an all-time great pitching season from Shane Bieber. If you were to project that out, his numbers in 2020 in 12 starts, and you were to project that out over 33 starts, Shane Bieber would have finished the year 22-3 with a 1.63 ERA and 340 strikeouts in 215 innings pitched. Just an absolute incredible season. Now, obviously, it's not as easy in baseball as just projecting out the numbers. You're going to have guys who are hot, guys who maybe aren't healthy, those types of things. But just looking at kind of what he accomplished in this shortened season, which really was all he had in front of him, an incredibly remarkable performance. We've talked about it on the show a little bit, but really feel like we should have had a segment almost every single episode on Shane Bieber and the performance that he had with the Cleveland Indians in 2020. Again, looking back at, let's say, last season, Justin Verlander won the Cy Young. I don't know that his numbers were necessarily better than Garrett Cole's, but Justin Verlander won the Cy Young Award last season with the Astros. He had a 21-6 record with a 2.58 ERA and 300 strikeouts. His teammate Garrett Cole was second in the American League Cy Young voting. He was 20-5 with a 2.50 ERA and 316 strikeouts. Of course, Garrett Cole signed a $324 million contract with the Yankees this offseason, and the Indians will see him in Game 1 of their playoff series against the Yankees tonight in Cleveland. So those were your two best pitchers in the American League last season. Again, we can get into whether or not there was anything weird going on in Houston with their spin rate, as Trevor Bauer would say, or with some kind of foreign substance, as they've been accused of. Again, I don't know that Justin Verlander at age 35, 36, whatever he is, suddenly got better, got more velocity. We can talk about that, and the Astros are now known cheaters, so wouldn't surprise me at all when you think about the numbers that Verlander and Cole both put up, and really they're just dominant, and the entire staff, the entire Houston Astros staff, cheaters. But anyways, looking at their numbers, even with those potential enhancements, they were both incredible, obviously, both incredible seasons, but really they would have been dwarfed by this season that Shane Bieber would have put together had he projected this out over the course of 30 to 33 starts. We'll never know. We'll never know, obviously, what Shane Bieber would have done had he got 30-plus starts this season. But if you look at those numbers that I mentioned, and I'll go back and kind of read it off again now that we've talked about Verlander and Cole from a year ago. Again, if you look at the projections for Shane Bieber for 2020, you're talking about a 22-3 record, a 1.63 ERA, and 340 strikeouts in 215 innings. That's what he would have projected out to over 33 starts had he continued what he did in the first 12 starts of the season. So just an incredible year. And in fact, again, not only does it stack up and dwarf any other season in Major League Baseball this year, and even those two great seasons from Verlander and Cole a year ago, but actually stacks up with some of the greatest seasons in recent, at least, MLB pitching history. I looked at probably the most two notable seasons that I could remember that if you said, what are the two best seasons you ever saw from a starting pitcher? What were the years where those guys were just so dominant, their numbers were so dominant, that they'll be kind of always in the record books, or at least always in the minds of folks who grew up in this era or were around for this era of baseball. And I think about the 1999 season from Pedro Martinez, of course, and then the 2002 season from Randy Johnson. So really, essentially the two best pitchers of their generation. Obviously, you could throw in Roger Clemens, who, of course, may also have been a cheater, and a few others, obviously, that were a part of that era. But Randy Johnson, Pedro Martinez, two guys that really stand alone, stand atop. Two guys really never been associated with steroids or anything like that. Not to say that we know for sure, but they never have really been associated with any of that. And so probably the second best season in modern Major League Baseball history was the 2002 season by Randy Johnson. He went 24-5 with a 2.32 ERA and 334 strikeouts. And that was a couple years after, 3 years after Pedro Martinez had his incredible season with the Boston Red Sox in 1999. Pedro Martinez went 23-4 with a 2.07 ERA and 313 strikeouts. So you're talking about some of the great pitching performances, some of the most impactful starting pitching that we've ever seen around this league, two of the all-time great seasons that will really kind of stand alone, stand the test of time, I believe, as people look at, that era, or really the post maybe 1990 era of baseball. Those two seasons are considered to be the gold standard. And yet Shane Bieber's numbers over the course of a full season in 2020 would have actually been better, at least for the most part, than any of those seasons, either of those seasons, Randy Johnson or Pedro Martinez. He would have finished maybe a win or two shy, but he would have gone 22-3 with a 1.63 ERA. 340 strikeouts would have been more than Randy Johnson in 2002. A 1.63 ERA would have been better than Pedro Martinez, who had a 2.07 ERA in 1999. So pretty insane when you think about what Shane Bieber did. Obviously much smaller sample size, but pretty insane how that, panned out this year to be an all-time great season, even if it was, only for a short period of time. Former Indian Trevor Bauer actually put up pretty similar numbers in Cincinnati this year outside of the wins and losses. I feel like I have to mention this because Trevor Bauer obviously was a part of the Cleveland Indians for the majority of his career, and he was a part of this pitching staff as recently as a year ago. And so Trevor Bauer, in his second season now in Cincinnati, he went 5-4 with a 1.32 ERA and a .79 WHIP. He struck out 100 batters in 73 innings. So a pretty remarkable year for the former Indian. Projected out over, again, 33 starts. That would have been a 15-12 record. So, again, not the win-loss record that Shane Bieber would have had this season, but 15-12 with a 1.32 ERA and 294 strikeouts. So just an absolutely incredible season, unhittable season for Trevor Bauer, and he's probably going to cash in big. Not sure if the Reds will be able to keep him or if he's going to end up, somewhere else. Again, some of these big money teams like the Dodgers, they seem to never run out of cash to throw around. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him end up, somewhere on the West Coast or something like that. But we'll see what happens with Trevor Bauer. But it's crazy to think that those two guys were on the same pitching staff last season, and now they potentially might take home the hardware for AL and NL Cy Young in 2020. Trevor Bauer is going to have a tough battle to come away with it. He's certainly in the mix for me, but he is probably, if I had to guess, going to finish second behind Yu Darvish of the Chicago Cubs, who went 8-3 with a 2.01 ERA and 93 strikeouts this season. So Trevor Bauer certainly in the mix. I think he had Cy Young caliber stuff. Had he won more games, had the Reds got him enough run support, then he might be in that conversation, maybe at the front of that conversation ahead of Yu Darvish. But in the end, I think it'll probably be Yu Darvish that wins the NL Cy Young with Trevor Bauer finishing second. And then in the American League, they had, there were a couple guys that had comparable statistics or at least a pretty solid season. Garrett Cole, again, of course, and Dallas Keuchel are probably the stiffest competition for Shane Bieber for Cy Young. Cole went 7-3 this season with a 2.84 ERA and 94 strikeouts in his first season in pinstripes. And then Keuchel, who was also in his first season with a new team pitching for the Chicago White Sox, was 6-2 with a 1.99 ERA, but not much of a strikeout pitcher, only 42 strikeouts on the season. He's more of a finesse ground ball guy, and certainly should be in the mix. I think that'll probably be your order. Shane Bieber, number 1, Garrett Cole, number 2, and Dallas Keuchel, number 3. You could maybe potentially flip-flop Garrett Cole and Dallas Keuchel. But I don't think anyone's catching Shane Bieber. I don't think there's any chance that they will. I don't think there's any chance that they should. I would be shocked. I don't see any scenario in which Shane Bieber doesn't take home the Cy Young for the American League. And now the question becomes, could he be in the mix for MVP with those numbers? So considering that both Garrett Cole and Dallas Keuchel, in my opinion, had numbers that were Cy Young caliber numbers. I think either one of those guys for the shortened season, you could argue that both Garrett Cole and Dallas Keuchel put up numbers that were worthy of the Cy Young Award. And yet Shane Bieber's numbers were just so much better and so clearly ahead of those guys that not only is he going to run away with the Cy Young Award, because there's just no way that anyone could look at that or have watched this season and think that Shane Bieber wasn't the best pitcher in baseball. But not only is he going to run away with the Cy Young, but he could be in the mix and should be in the mix, in my opinion, for the American League Most Valuable Player. And in terms of, the actual definition, when you step back and don't think about the award and historical winners, kind of like some other MVP awards, they tend to go to the same types of positions. Think about the term or the definition of most valuable. And I would argue that if you ever step back and say most valuable, first of all, if you went by that definition, LeBron James would win the MVP every season in the NBA. That guy's just insane, going to his 10th NBA Finals in 11 seasons. And he is the most valuable player on the court. He's maybe not always the best scorer, maybe doesn't always put up the best numbers, but he is the most valuable player on the court pretty much every single night, probably 49 out of 50 games that he plays. LeBron is the best and most valuable player on the court. And not to compare Shane Bieber to LeBron, but I would say if you looked at the definition of most valuable, who did the most for their team and where would their team be without them, I would say that nobody had more value. No one had a bigger impact on their team, their season, than Shane Bieber. I mean, where would the Indians be in 2020 without that season from Shane Bieber? They can't hit for much of the season. Now they've turned it on as of late, but they couldn't hit for much of the season. They had, issues with guys like Zach Plesac and Mike Clevenger and their situation. Tristan McKenzie didn't come up until late in the year. They they were not a team that was going to go out and compete unless they got elite starting pitching. And they did all season long. Carlos Carrasco, Zach Plesac were great for the Indians. Tristan McKenzie, as I mentioned, when he came up, pitched really well for the Indians. But I believe that the most valuable player in terms of the true value they brought to their team and where the team would be without them has to be Shane Bieber. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to win the MVP, but in my opinion, he is the most valuable player to any American League team because I don't know the Indians are anywhere without him. They're not really a playoff team without him this season. And so that was, my justification for saying that he's certainly in the mix, probably the most valuable of anyone in the American League. The best position player, most valuable position player was almost certainly Jose Abreu. So the first baseman for the White Sox, he hit .317 with 19 home runs, 15 doubles, and 60 RBIs. He was right behind Luke Voit of the Yankees, who hit 22 home runs, and Abreu led the major leagues in runs batted in this season with 60. So Voit also could be in the mix potentially for MVP, but I really think it'll end up being a two-horse race down the stretch between Shane Bieber and Jose Abreu. Again, if you look at maybe what he would have done over an entire season, let's say projecting out Abreu's numbers over 550 at-bats, Abreu would have hit 44 home runs and driven in 138 RBIs this season. And so it's certainly MVP numbers when you consider that he also, again, if you project it out, would have hit .317. So absolutely great numbers. Are they all-time numbers, though? Are they, one of the top 10 or even, top 20 performances of the last 20 or 30 years? I wouldn't say so. I know multiple seasons where Manny Ramirez had very similar numbers for the Cleveland Indians and didn't win the MVP award, or for the Boston Red Sox and didn't win the MVP award. So yeah, very, very good numbers. And, you look at last year's AL MVP, Mike Trout, he hit .291 with 45 homers, 104 RBIs, 110 runs, 110 walks, and 11 steals. So the true definition of a 5 or 6 tool player, when you think about a guy who can run, who can hit, who can defend, and who can also draw walks the way that he does. So again, Mike Trout could potentially be that perennial MVP every year, although the Angels never win anything. And since the Angels never win anything, I'm sorry, but at some point you can't give the MVP to a guy who's on a team that's really not competitive. And certainly, Mike Trout has deserved everything that he's gotten. He is the best overall player in baseball, but I think it's going to come down to Shane Bieber and Jose Abreu this season. Abreu's numbers very impressive, not all-time impressive, not numbers that would blow your mind over the course of the season had he had 550 at-bats, which is a reasonable amount for a full season. So, again, I think he's in the conversation. But the White Sox also completely faded down the stretch. They lost 9 of their final 11 games. They got swept in Cleveland, and, they really limped into the playoffs. I'm not blaming that on Jose Abreu. He played well really over the last month of the season. But the White Sox really dropped off at the end of the year, and so it's going to be close. I don't think they'll give it to Shane Bieber because he's a pitcher, and that doesn't seem to be something they're willing to do. But it's going to be close, and really incredible season for Shane Bieber. I think he deserves to be the MVP this year, just based on his numbers being so incredible when you project them out over the course of 33 starts. But we'll see. I'm sure they're not looking at it quite that way, and Abreu's numbers are pretty impressive as well. Okay, so moving on to the next topic here, we're actually going to talk about another Jose, not Jose Abreu, but Jose Ramirez. And this is another guy who, if he hadn't had that kind of slow patch, or if he hadn't had that rough month in the middle of the season, we might be talking about Jose Ramirez in that conversation for AL MVP. In fact, we almost certainly would be talking about Jose Ramirez in that conversation. We might be talking about Jose Ramirez being ahead of Shane Bieber and taking home the hardware. And so another guy who was incredibly valuable to his team when you think about the Indians not being able to hit for much of the season, really needing someone that could spark the offense. And that's exactly what Jose Ramirez has done over the last month. When the Indians really needed it, when they were in danger, really of falling out of contention, Jose Ramirez really brought this team back to life and carried them on his back over the last month or last 6 weeks of the season. Finished the year with a .292 average, 17 home runs, 10 steals, and 46 RBI. So one of the league leaders in home runs. Numbers are good across the board, but really it was over the last month where Ramirez just went on a tear and really lifted the Indians to heights that I wasn't sure they would get back to a team that not only ended up finishing ahead of the White Sox and getting darn near close to the Twins for the AL Central, but a team that could potentially be dangerous in the playoffs, because if Jose Ramirez is hitting like that and you're getting pitching like they got from Cy Bieber and some of these other guys, all of a sudden you're going to be really, really tough to beat. So over the last 28 days of the season, Jose Ramirez hit .360 with 10 of those 17 home runs and 24 RBI. He hit .396 over the final 2 weeks of the season. And again, really carried this team down the stretch, carried them to that sweep of the White Sox, carried them all the way to the playoffs and the number 4 seed, really as essentially the hottest hitter in baseball. And had he not had that month in August where he hit .202 because he was battling the hand injury, we might be talking about Jose Ramirez and Cy Bieber either competing for the MVP or potentially canceling each other out, you know how that tends to work, because they're right there in the MVP voting. So he won't get a lot of consideration. His overall numbers are not really where, you know, someone like Jose Abreu's are, but an incredible season, an incredible down-the-stretch performance by Jose Ramirez, really carrying this team. And here's some other numbers to think about for Jose Ramirez in 2020, when, again, there were stretches where you wondered, is Jose Ramirez going to be the same guy he used to be? He struggled in the second half of last season, struggled for some stretches in this season. Again, he was really not hitting the way that you would have wanted Jose Ramirez to hit as they got into September, and then just absolutely turned it on in the month of September. And so looking at his kind of breakouts for this season, Jose Ramirez ended up hitting .345 this season with runners in scoring position. So when the Indians absolutely needed a hit, and I don't know this statistically, but anecdotally and almost certainly from watching this team, they had to be one of the worst in baseball, worst in the American League, or at least worst among these playoff teams at getting clutch hits with guys on base. And all season, that's where they struggled. They were able to put runners on, and they just couldn't drive them in, drive them over, turn them into runs. And that's where Jose Ramirez really carried this team. .345 on the season with runners in scoring position. He hit .300 with men on base. And he hit 13 of his 17 home runs in games that were decided by 3 runs or less. So in those tight games, when the Indians desperately needed offense and their pitching, again, was giving them a great performance, a lot of those pitching efforts went to waste. But Jose Ramirez made sure that down the stretch that those pitching performances did not go to waste. The Indians won a lot of those games down the stretch because of Jose Ramirez. Now, he didn't do it alone. They had some other guys that ended up with decent seasons, nobody other than Ramirez that really hit the cover off the ball this season, or, if you look across the board at their numbers, it really was Ramirez that kind of stood alone with the 17 homers, 46 RBIs. Franmil Reyes, obviously, he had a really big stretch after he hit those 2 long home runs in Detroit. He had a great stretch when Jose Ramirez was struggling in August. Franmil Reyes really carried the team, finished the year with 9 home runs, 34 RBIs, and hit .275, and was absolutely their second best hitter for the season. Francisco Lindor, not a great season. 8 home runs, 13 doubles, 27 RBIs, 6 steals, hit .258, struck out 41 times, only walked 24 times. So not a great season for Francisco Lindor. When you think about Jose Ramirez ended up slugging .607 for the year, Lindor was at .415. So they really, really need Francisco Lindor to turn it on in the playoffs. And that's where he typically shines, right? He just had that quote this week about, if you want to be famous, this is when it starts. This is when it starts for Frankie Lindor. He has to show up. He has to be that guy. You can't have Jose Ramirez carrying you every single night. They need Francisco Lindor to be that number 2 punch. And if he's hitting well, then you've got 3 guys right there in the middle of your lineup with Ramirez, Reyes, and Lindor that can really hurt you. You've also got Cesar Hernandez, who had a fantastic season, led the American League, I believe, in doubles with 20, or was right there at the top towards the end in doubles with 20 on the season. So fantastic. Again, you think about only 60 games. You're talking about a guy who was on pace to hit 50 doubles this year. Ended the year with a 283 batting average, and I think really injected life. Was another guy who got some clutch hits throughout the year, probably their number 2 clutch hitter all year, and was really, really a nice pickup for them and a nice kind of step up from what they got out of Jason Kipnis. Love Jason Kipnis, but where he was the last few years and to what they got this year from Cesar Hernandez, completely different. But that was about it. I mean, Carlos Santana did some weird Carlos Santana things, right? He had 30 RBIs on the season, third on the team. He had more walks than strikeouts, 47 walks to lead the team. And he had a 349 on base percentage, despite the fact he only hit 199 on the season. So Carlos Santana hit less than 200, had almost a 350 on base percentage. So at least he gives you something, but you got to hope he can give you some hitting, and he's starting to hit better as of late. You got to hope he can give you some hitting in the playoffs, especially if they're going to beat the Yankees. All right, so that takes us into our final topic of this episode, and we're going to talk about those damn Yankees and this first-round matchup that the Indians have with the New York Yankees. I know most Cleveland fans are not happy, again, to see the Yankees in the first round of the playoffs when you kind of saw those potential scenarios going into the final weekend, and even on the final day, there was about 8 different ways this could have played out, 8 different scenarios for the Indians. Obviously, they'll take the fact they're playing at home, and I think you got to be happy they're not playing the Minnesota Twins. I don't think enough people are giving credit to what the Tampa Bay Rays and the Oakland Athletics did this season. I think people view them as not as much of a threat as a team like the Yankees, but I'm not so sure that's true. This was a team that looked like a juggernaut early in the season, but they ended up finishing the year just 33-27, so only 6 games over 500. They were really, really good in Yankee Stadium. They were 22-9 at home and abysmal on the road. They were 11-18 on the road, where they will open the series tonight against the Cleveland Indians in Cleveland. And again, you got to hope if you're an Indians fan, then that continues, that the Yankees have trouble on the road. So this game 1 is going to be a very big indicator in my mind of how this series is going to go. You've got Cy Bieber on the mound against Garrett Cole in Cleveland on the road, where the Yankees have struggled all season. And so you got to hope that that's the Yankees team that shows up in the first round of the playoffs. Now, they did score 315 runs, which led the American League, but they allowed 270 runs, which was the third highest among all of these AL playoff teams. So by comparison, Tampa and Oakland, which I just mentioned, Tampa allowed 229 runs this season, Oakland 232. The Twins allowed 215 runs, which was the second best in the American League behind, of course, your Cleveland Indians, who allowed an AL best 209 runs all season. So 209 runs was the best, not only in the American League, but actually the best in all of baseball. And so 209 runs over the course of 60 games, fantastic season for the Indians pitching. And the Twins, again, were right there behind them, second in the American League, third in baseball behind the Indians and the Dodgers, who allowed 213 runs this season. Dodgers, obviously, the prohibitive favorite to win the World Series. They've been the best team in baseball all year. They've got the best player in baseball in Mookie Betts, who will be your NL MVP, certainly. But, again, the Twins are the team that I didn't want to play. And, again, they're in the division, so there's some bad blood there a little bit. I think the Twins have had the Indians number the same way the Indians have had the White Sox number. I don't think the Chicago White Sox wanted to play the Indians again or want anything to do with the Indians in these playoffs because, again, they've just had their number all year. Now, you go to the other side, again, the Indians allowed the fewest runs in all of baseball. However, they only scored 248 runs. So they ended up with the lowest run scored total of any of the AL playoff teams. So that shouldn't come as a big shock to anyone. If you watch the Indians play this season, they were certainly not a team that was going to come out and, out-hit a lot of people. But that certainly means now that they are going to have to win this series, anything that they win in the playoffs, they are going to have to win on the strength of their pitching. They are not going to go out there and out-hit the Yankees in a slugfest. Although the numbers, when I looked at the Yankees, the numbers are not as impressive as what you might expect. Again, they scored a lot of runs early in the season when their lineup was healthy. And then you look at the final numbers, not all that impressive across the board when you look at some of the guys in their lineup. Now, Luke Voit was a monster. He was an AL MVP candidate, 22 home runs, 52 RBIs, and 213 at bats. DJ LeMahieu, their second baseman, he had another phenomenal season, hit 364 with 10 home runs in 195 at bats. So those two guys had great seasons, but the rest of their lineup really didn't produce the way you would think. Giancarlo Stanton, missed a big chunk of the season with a hamstring injury. He has only hit one home run since coming back on September 15th after missing more than a month of the season with that hamstring injury, and he finished the year with just 4 home runs. That's 2 years in a row now where Giancarlo Stanton has been hurt, and you don't know exactly what you're going to get from him. And then Aaron Judge, their other big hitter, guy who early in the season looked like the reincarnation of Babe Ruth. He was slamming the ball into the seats early in the year. I remember watching a couple of those games thinking, how could the Indians ever contend with a team like this when you've got a guy who can put it in the seats anytime that he wants? Seemed like that guy could have a 3-4 home run game, every other night if they pitched to him. And then when I looked up the final numbers, he finished the year with 9 home runs in 101 at-bats. Now, again, battled some injuries. They haven't been healthy for a lot of the season. So, we know what they're capable of. If Giancarlo Stanton and Aaron Judge are healthy, when you've got guys like Voit and LeMahieu in that lineup and some of the other guys that they've got as well, we know that lineup is as dangerous as any lineup in baseball. So it is going to take an incredible effort by these Indian starters, and that has to start tonight. That has to start in game 1 of this playoff series with Shane Bieber. He's got to go out and really outpitch Garrett Cole, because we know the Indians are going to struggle most likely with a guy of Garrett Cole's caliber. And we can't have another situation like we had with Corey Kluber. The Indians cannot afford, and they couldn't afford it at that time either, but they cannot afford another Corey Kluber situation. And I'm as big of a Corey Kluber fan, as you'll find, but they just cannot have another one of those type of situations where a guy has an incredible season, a Cy Young season, is the best pitcher in baseball all year, and then that doesn't show up in the playoffs. That doesn't show up when they need it the most. They are going to need Shane Bieber to come out and pitch like a Cy Young Award winner, to pitch like the best pitcher in baseball, and to really get them, where they need to be. They're going to need him to show up and set the tone in game 1 of the series. They decided to go with Carlos Carrasco in game 2. Just based on what I saw this year, I probably would have gone with Zach Plesac before I kind of looked closer at the numbers. But I get the decision to go with the veteran. Obviously, Carrasco's been there. He's been in the postseason. He's been a part of this team and been a part of some big moments in the postseason. So obviously, I think Cookie Carrasco has earned that right to be the number 2 starter. Again, Zach Plesac was the better pitcher, at least somewhat on paper during the regular season. He was 4-2 with a 2.28 ERA and 57 strikeouts in 55 innings. But Carrasco, he had a couple rough starts there in the middle, but he ended up with some great numbers for the year. He ended up with a 2.91 ERA and 82 strikeouts in 68 innings for the season. And so Carrasco is set to start game 2 of the series, and he's pitching in his 3rd postseason with the Indians, so 3rd postseason game with the Indians. He made previous starts in the 2017 and 2018 ALDS and had a 1.64 ERA with 10 strikeouts in those 2 starts. He only allowed 2 earned runs in 11 innings. So after hearing that and doing a little more digging there, completely makes sense why the Indians would throw Carrasco in game 2, saving Plesac for game 3. He's the young guy. He's the guy who really hasn't been here before. And so he should set you up nicely with a game 3 advantage, but they need those 2 guys to pitch well. Again, if one of those guys comes out and doesn't pitch well, they're going to be in trouble, because they have relied on the starters. They have relied on this pitching staff all season, and that's going to continue in the playoffs for sure. The Yankees are going with Masahiro Tanaka in game 2, and we've all seen that story before. The Indians have struggled against him in the past. They struggled against him a couple years ago when they faced him in the playoffs, and so they're going to need Cookie to outpitch Tanaka in game 2 if they're going to have a chance to really take control of this series early on. Tanaka has been really kind of a miracle for the Yankees. He's just so average in the regular season. It seems like every single year his numbers are very pedestrian in the regular season. but his playoff numbers are ridiculous. In his Yankee career, Tanaka has a 1.76 ERA with 37 strikeouts and 8 starts. Hitters are hitting just 157 against him in the playoffs, and he's gone 2-1 with a 2.25 ERA in his 3 starts last year in the playoffs. So you're talking about a guy who the numbers for the regular season suggest he's not anywhere near the caliber as some of these Indian starters, but we all know playoffs are different. Tanaka, one of the better playoff pitchers in baseball. So the Indians have their hands full in games 1 and game 2. So they're going to need Shane Bieber and Carlos Carrasco to pitch lights out in both of those games. And then we don't know who's going to be the game 3 starter for the Yankees. They haven't announced that yet. James Paxton is out for the season, so he's not available. And really, in my mind, they only have one viable option. It's going to have to be 37-year-old starter J.A. Happ. It almost has to be, given the season that he had, and then just given kind of the Indians and their history with guys like Happ, 37-year-old lefties who for some reason they absolutely cannot hit. We've all seen that story before as well. So, of course, if you're an Indians fan, you should already mentally prepare yourself for the fact they're going to pitch Happ in game 3. He was 2-2 with a 3.47 ERA in 9 starts for the Yankees this season, so he was really their third best pitcher anyways, but you just know how this is going to play out. Happ's going to pitch game 3, and lefties, these guys that shouldn't always give the Indians trouble in big games. So, again, on paper, this Cleveland Indians team should win this series. They should be the better team. They should have the better rotation. Certainly not the better lineup, but again, this Yankees lineup has been off and on throughout the season. And so the Indians on paper should be the clear-cut better team. But we know how these series are. They never play out the way that you expect on paper. The Indians are going to need some hitting at some point because the Yankees have the bats to get to these Indians pitchers at some point. One of the areas that they're susceptible to, in my mind, is home runs. Well, that's what the Yankees do well. So you've got some kind of careful areas to watch there. They've got some, veteran starters in Tanaka and Happ that could be a problem for this Indians lineup. And then they've got, the big arms at the back of their bullpen, Chapman and Zach Britton. And so, depending on how much they're willing to throw those guys, it could be a very short game for the Indians. And they're going to have to find a way to manufacture runs. So, again, on paper, the Indians have more pitching, better depth, more arms they can throw at you throughout the series. And so, they should have a clear advantage when pitching is at a premium, but you know how these games play out. And so the Indians should have a big advantage in game 3 with Zach Plesac, who's been fantastic all year, versus Happ, who's been very average. But again, I think that'll be a very close pitching matchup when you consider Happ being the veteran and the left-hander. And so, then it comes down to the Indians have a lot of other guys they can throw at you. Tristan McKenzie, Aaron Savale, Cal Quantrill. They can throw all those guys and hope to get good innings from any of those guys when they throw them out there. And then at the back end of the bullpen, they've got to feel pretty comfortable with relying on James Karinchak, Nick Wittgren, and being able to turn the ball over to those guys. Certainly not as dominant as the Yankees back end. So, again, something to keep an eye on. But another big thing here will be Brad Hand. They're going to need Brad Hand to be good Brad Hand. They're going to need Brad Hand to be the guy who pitched really well down the stretch this season. And they're going to need everybody, essentially all of their pitchers, to pitch well in the playoffs because, again, I think the Yankees look beatable, but it depends on what Yankees team shows up. If they show up and they're the team they were in the regular season, then the Indians should be the better team. The Indians, I think, have the potential to, get some better hitting out of some of these guys, Santana, Francisco Lindor in the playoffs than they did as we're kind of hitting the reset button here. But if the Yankees show up and they're the Yankees that they looked like early in the season or like we've seen in the past, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. It's going to be, one of those series where, one outing, here or there could go a long way. If the Indians find a way to get to one of those pitchers, or if the Yankees find a way to get to the Indians pitchers in one of these games, that could really swing, the entire series. You're using your bullpen a lot differently if your starter gets hit. But if they allow the Yankee starters to go inning for inning against their starters, I think the Yankees have the advantage. So it's going to be fun to watch, and hopefully this has been a fun episode for everyone. I know I had a blast, so thank you for listening. Excited to get these playoffs started, and hopefully we'll be talking about a number of series here as the Indians try to make a run here in the postseason. Again, I think the American League is wide open. The only team that I don't think the Indians can stack up against right now is the Twins, just because they really couldn't beat the Twins in the regular season. But again, I don't think enough people are giving credit to the Oakland A's or Tampa Bay Rays, but I still like the Indians' chances in a game against either of those teams. I still think the Indians have better pitching than either of those teams. And so if the Indians do get past the Yankees, if they come out and look good and they beat the Yankees and get that monkey off their back in the first round, I think that could give them the confidence. That could be one of those things. We've seen it before in Cleveland where these teams just get on a roll. They just seem to catch that magic fever, and that ends up being something that can take them a lot further than just breaking down the numbers from the regular season and who hit well, who didn't hit well. A lot of times they got to get in that rhythm, get on that run. And if they beat the Yankees in the first round, I think, you could be looking at something special. Wouldn't be surprised if they beat the Yankees, went all the way to the World Series. Wouldn't be surprised if they lost to the Yankees in the first round. So that's the kind of, I think, high tilt situation that we're dealing with this baseball team, just because they can't hit the ball consistently or in the clutch the way that I think they need to really maximize this pitching staff. Imagine if they had, a great lineup to pair with this pitching staff, but that's a story for another day and another tall glass of bourbon to drink away the sorrows of this front office not being able to get the hitters they want because the owners won't give them the money to spend. So, again, I had a blast. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, give us a follow, leave us a 5-star rating, do all those good things. You can also follow the show on Twitter at JustOutsidePod, and you can certainly give me a follow as well at BCastOhio. But thanks for listening, and look forward to catching up with you again next week.